first time back. To what extent has the U.S. ever genuinely adhered to a rules-based order versus using it as a rhetorical device to maintain global hegemony? I'll take my answer off here.
Well, this is the thing, though. I mean, I think that the United States, as the center of global hegemony, does have rules that it adheres to. The question is, are those rules dictated by other foreign powers? I think that there are internal mechanisms that the hierarchy of American empire usually use to facilitate how they govern and have governed foreign policy since the advent of the post-World War II global liberal order that has centered largely on the United States as the hegemon of record in the world. You know, even though we did have the NATO alliance that was during the Cold War designed to thwart the advances of the Soviet Union, largely pretty much since World War II, the United States has been at the fulcrum of geopolitics on the planet. And I would argue that there have been rules that have governed how those powers would be dictated in the affairs of the world. Now, just because there are rules doesn't mean that I agree with those rules, and it doesn't mean that I think that those rules are fair, based on fair or just principles. I would argue that usually those rules are based on a preservation of capitalist hierarchy, realpolitik, geostrategic avenues of thoroughfares that are of particular importance, and an overall hierarchy of goals of achievement that have been necessary for the maintenance of American empire and its corporate acolytes. But at the same time, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's a fair system to people of the global south and the countries that do not have the ability to maintain the 800 some odd foreign bases that we have in the United States. So to answer your question more directly, I think the United States has always had rules since its rise as a global hegemon. But at the same time, those rules are internal to its own mechanisms and not something that work to the advantage of other powers.
Derek Vaughn, I'll pass it to you.
The rules-based international order is, a nice word for saying the shit the British Empire did that America inherited after World War II. Which is not to say that there wasn't rules and that we haven't violated them. The rules-based international order that we pretty much maintained after Bretton Woods started being undone as early as the 1970s in financial spaces, and in the mid to late 1990s in the precursor to the War on Terror and geopolitical military ones. If we are to take Trump's recent announcements seriously, and we can talk about whether or not we are, that's a whole different ball game. And I think things are going to be a lot more interesting domestically than people think. By that, I mean, like, there's already fractures in the Trumpist movement showing up immediately. But let's just black that out for a second. Today, he announced the creation of the External Revenue Service, the ERS, which he will supposedly put into place on January 25th. We haven't had a new dumb international apparatus since George Bush and the Department of Homeland Security, which people need to remind yourselves is not actually that old. It started right after 9/11. A few other things we have to deal with is, if he's serious about the annexation of Greenland and a few other things, there are some things to be looking out for, because that means that he really doesn't care about completely disbarring NATO, which would be a massive shift in the quote rules-based international order. It's the kind of one we haven't seen since World War II. But it's hard to know what to take seriously from him. I remember his policy papers in 2016. I used to read them. He released plenty. He didn't do most of them. Things that I think we can see that's going to be interesting is how much is the Republican Senate going to go along with him, considering the leader of the Senate is still non-Trump loyalist. John Thune is not a Trump loyalist. we don't know what capital really wants. I mean, we've seen the tech bros get all switch which ring they were kissing. We should all remind ourselves that they were all kissing a different ring as little as 4 years ago. We used finance capital was seen as hostile to the GOP after a lot of the stuff that happened under Trump 1, and that seems to have all been evaporated. So someone asked, what's the connection between acquiring Greenland and disbanding NATO? Denmark is a NATO member, and you're threatening military action against a NATO member. It would effectively dissolve the alliance. Just pointing that out. There's a lot that this would actually indicate. It is a return to the Truman Doctrine, pretty hardcore actually, which is a traditional American doctrine, one that often gets called isolationist, but really is just multipolar imperial. Because as I've been saying since about 2007, multipolarity actually implies something like the 19th century, not something new, but it will require a complete rewriting of the quote rules-based international order, unquote, whatever the fuck that is. But that unraveling's been slow going for a long time. That's really my primary point. I'd love to hear what a non-American has to say about this, but I mean, it does seem weird to be threatening a fairly integrated North America with chaos at a particular juncture, when you're also seemingly pivoting away from Europe. But we have to look at that. And the other two things we have to look at, that's kind of discrediting and I haven't heard enough about, Trump apparently did do the whole Nixon to China thing on Gaza. I was watching Israeli news this afternoon and they were complaining on Israeli news in Hebrew. And since I can listen to Hebrew, I can tell you what they were saying, that they think Trump betrayed them in forcing a capitulation without a whole lot of benefit to them on the Gaza situation and the next 24-hour ceasefire, which is interesting because that would imply that the Dems really could have done it the entire time, but lacked the political will and or capital. So you're gonna have a lot to deal with in looking through what all this stuff implies. But I mean, talking about the rules-based international order, I mean, like, really, there was a decision point that could have been made to go back to it after the Bush administration, under the Obama administration, and Obama chose not to. We're dealing with the repercussions of that now.
I think that it would be useful to distinguish between a couple of different things that might get otherwise conflated. There's this liberal internationalist, and liberal in a good way, foreign policy vision for something like United Nations, or before that, the League of Nations, some kind of quasi-world federation or government where disputes are settled through discussion, consultation, where there are regular, predictable channels for dispute resolution among countries, and where communication, international law, some other types of there's a regular foundation for international exchange from the government level all the way down to sending the mail and getting it to your friend in Laos, being able to visit your family on the other side of the world, whether they're in New Guinea or Old Guinea. And it's a hopeful vision. There's a reason why it resonates positively with a lot of people. That's the world that we were kind of promised after World War II. And there are organizations which backstop this international cooperation, some that have worked better than others. The fact that regular mail can be delivered from any country in the world to any country in the world, if you think about it, is a logistical and organizational achievement. It's a milestone of global integration. The universal adoption of passports and visas for international travel. These are components of a global rules-based order, which allows for not just heads of state, but everybody to participate in life beyond the borders of the country they happen to be born in. So there's that. And there's the most optimistic vision that you can build that out into a system which allows everyone around the world to live in peace and to interact in ways that maintain mutual respect and that are regular and predictable and stable. The highest aspiration might be using the United Nations as intended, as a forum for international dispute resolution, with countries recognizing UN sanctions or UN resolutions, including the major powers. That's not the world we're living. That's not the world we live in, but that would be the highest form, the highest expression of this, not only liberal, but certainly liberal in origin aspiration for mankind. Then there's what Pascal has described as the internal rules through which American hegemony operates. And since the end of World War II, the United Nations has sometimes been useful to the operation of American hegemony, and sometimes it's been an obstacle. And we see the ebb and flow of the relevance and prominence of the UN in American culture following that utility. After the end of the Cold War, there was this hope that that liberal aspiration might be achieved, that instead of Cold War security politics, you might have international multilateralism serving as the foundation for global affairs. But instead, American imperialism, American hegemony co-opted the rules that were useful, co-opted the structures that were useful, reoriented things like the EU as a tool of Western expansion, maintained and even expanded NATO, despite the fact that the existential threat of the USSR was no longer there, and projected power in an unabashed, unembarrassed way, even creating this quasi-gulag-style archipelago of black sites, torture centers, and military bases all over the world, many of which were kept secret even from the United States public and the host governments where they operated. Now, that limited structure for the operation of American hegemony. So it's going to be power. It's got everybody do what America says, but at least there's some regularity. At least things like borders are inviolable. We'll change the government on the other side of the border if we don't like it, but we won't move around the border posts. We're going to impose one-sided trade agreements that benefit the United States, that benefit certain sectors of the United States most of all, but we're not going to cheat on our obligations in the trade agreements, things like that. That minimum level can no longer be taken for granted. As Varn pointed out, one of the key institutions of American hegemony is the NATO alliance. But if America is threatening its own NATO allies, then that alliance becomes meaningless to anybody who believed themselves to be protected by it. After all, you join NATO because you don't want to be invaded. You believe that the threat was always going to come from the East, but just because it comes from the West doesn't make it any less coercive. And many European states, many American allies, have gone along with American hegemony, believing that that was an alternative to being the victim of direct American coercion. If Canada, which has been carrying water for the United States for a very long time, which has been a very, very well-behaved ally and neighbor, if Canada can be threatened with annexation, if it can be reduced to the 51st state, then what guarantee is there for anyone? And maybe we should start talking to other powers. So I think that there is a substantial shift in having a president that's willing to shred all of the very limited internal requirements that American hegemony had on the hegemon, and shift to a system of arbitrary coercion.